She begged for death, but death sent her something worse, someone who refused to let her die. The fever had hollowed her out weeks ago. What remained was bone wrapped in translucent skin, a respirator's wheeze, and the memory of a mother's hand releasing hers at the wrought iron gate of Ashmore Estate. Winter had turned the grounds to ash. December rain fell like accusations. Iris had been 17 when they abandoned her. The sickness came first. Consumption, they called it in whispered tones, though the doctors knew better. Some unknown degradation of the blood. Her parents had watched her deteriorate for 3 months in their London townhouse before deciding she was no longer their daughter, only a reminder of mortality wearing her face. The gate had seemed merciful then. At least she wouldn't die in her childhood bed, watching her mother's disgust mount with each labored breath. That was 48 hours ago. Now, huddled against the stone pillar, Iris understood that mercy was a concept invented by people who had never truly suffered. The cold had stopped hurting. Her body had surrendered to it, and that surrender felt like acceptance. She closed her eyes and waited for the mercy to finish what it had started. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, each one a percussion against the wet gravel that made her eyelids flicker, though she lacked the strength to turn her head. A shadow fell across her face. The footsteps stopped. "You're alive," a voice said. Not a question, an observation made with the tone of someone discovering a contradiction in philosophy. Iris forced her eyes open. The figure above her was impossibly tall, silhouetted against the gray afternoon. She could make out the shape of his face, sharp, geometric, beautiful in a way that seemed dangerous. His eyes were the color of old amber, catching what little light remained in the dying day and holding it prisoner. He wore no coat. The rain darkened his shirt but didn't seem to touch him, as though the weather had made an agreement to leave him untouched. "Not for long," Iris managed. Her voice was a husk. She almost didn't recognize it. The man, no, not quite a man. Something older lived behind those eyes, crouched beside her with an economy of motion that suggested he didn't need to move at all, that crouching was a courtesy to her limited perception. Up close, she could see the architecture of his face, cheekbones carved by centuries, a jaw set with the weight of decisions made and unmade, a mouth that had forgotten how to smile. "Why are you here?" he asked. "Because I'm dying," Iris said, "and my parents didn't want to watch." Something flickered across his face. Not pity. She'd seen pity before, and it always came with an edge of relief that it wasn't the observer suffering instead. This was different. This was recognition. "I'm Adrian," he said. "This is my estate. Then you should return inside. I'll be gone by morning." Adrian studied her with an intensity that felt like being read. Not just seen, understood. Her ribs, the blue tracery of veins beneath her wrists, the way her left eye didn't open as wide as her right because the fever had swollen something behind it, the small tremor in her fingers, the resignation in her breathing. "What's your name?" "Iris." "Iris." He said it like a prayer in a language that had died centuries ago. "Come inside. I'm contagious. The fever." "I know what you are," Adrian said quietly. And the way he said it made her understand that he wasn't referring to her illness. He was referring to something deeper, something that lived in the architecture of her blood. He stood and extended his hand. It was pale, impossibly graceful, with fingers that seemed too long to be human. There was a scar running from his wrist to his knuckle, thin, silver, and so old it had become part of the landscape of his skin. Iris stared at it. "You can die here in the rain," Adrian continued, "abandoned and cold. Or you can come inside and discover that death is not the end of your story. It's merely a chapter you haven't learned to read yet." "You're mad," Iris whispered. "Perhaps," he acknowledged, But I've been mad for 417 years, and I've learned to do it well." She should have been afraid. Every instinct, every rational thread still left in her fevered mind screamed that this was danger, that the beauty of his face was a predator's mask, that the light in his eyes was hunger dressed as mercy. Instead, she reached for his hand. The moment their skin touched, Iris felt it, a current that had nothing to do with electricity and everything to do with recognition. His hand was cold, but not with the cold of winter. It was the cold of eternity, of choosing not to end, of surviving when survival had become a curse. "I don't even know you," she said. "No," Adrian agreed, helping her to her feet, or attempting to. Her legs had forgotten their function. He caught her before she fell, lifting her as though she weighed nothing, as though she were made of paper and starlight instead of bone and betrayal. "But I know what you are, and I know that you deserve to live long enough to discover it yourself." As he carried her through the gate, away from the rain and toward the dark manor looming beyond, Iris felt something shift inside her chest. Not hope. She'd abandoned that at her mother's bedside. But something that rhymed with it. Something that might, in time, become choice. The gate closed behind them with a sound like a lock turning in a door that had been waiting centuries to be opened. The house smelled of old velvet and older secrets. Adrian had placed her in a room that felt less like a bedroom and more like a museum dedicated to the religion of beauty. Four-poster bed with midnight silk, mahogany wardrobe carved with roses and thorns, a vanity with a mirror so ancient it seemed to show not reflections, but memories, images of women who had stood before it centuries ago, doing the small rituals of survival. A fire burned in the hearth. Real flames, not the gas pretense that had heated her parents' London townhouse. These flames moved with intention, casting shadows that danced like they were alive. Iris lay beneath coverlets that felt like clouds had been caught and flattened into fabric. Her fever had broken sometime in the night, or perhaps it had never broken at all, but simply transformed into something else. Something that felt less like sickness and more like awakening. Adrian appeared in the doorway carrying a basin of water and cloths. "You're awake," he said. She nodded. She wanted to speak but found that words had become complicated things, requiring energy she was still learning to allocate. He set the basin on the vanity and moved to the window, pulling back curtains that had been drawn since her arrival. Afternoon light fell across the room in golden bars, and Adrian stood within it as though he were posing for a portrait. Except the light didn't touch him the way it touched other things. It seemed to recognize him as an anomaly and simply flowed around him, leaving him in a pocket of shadow, despite standing directly beneath the sun's reach. "The light bothers you," Iris observed. It wasn't a question. "The light no longer affects me the way it once did," Adrian corrected. He turned from the window and moved to her bedside. "May I?" She nodded, and he sat on the edge of the mattress with the careful precision of someone who had learned not to disturb the world around him. He dipped one of the cloths into the water, scented with rose and something else, something that made her think of old libraries and forgotten prayers, and began to gently wipe her face. The tenderness of it was almost unbearable. "Why?" she asked. Her voice was stronger now, though still thin as glass. "Why didn't you leave me to die?" Adrian continued his careful work, moving the cloth across her forehead, her cheeks, the hollow of her throat. "Because I made a promise 400 years ago to a girl who looked very much like you. She was abandoned too. She died anyway, despite my promises." He paused. The cloth stilled. "I've been trying to keep that promise ever since. By saving dying girls at your gate? By refusing to accept that some losses are final," he said. He set down the cloth and met her eyes directly. In the afternoon light, his irises seemed to contain entire universes. "You're not dying, Iris. I can feel the sickness still." "Your sickness is transforming," Adrian interrupted. It has been for hours. Your body is learning to process it as power instead of decay. Can't you feel it? The way your pulse is steadying. The way the fever is becoming something else? Something that tastes like lightning on your tongue? Iris did feel it. She'd thought the sensation was just another phase of her illness, another torment the disease had invented. But as Adrian described it, she recognized it for what it was. Change. Metamorphosis. "What are you?" she whispered. Adrian stood and moved to the vanity. He lifted the ancient mirror carefully, as though it were made of spun glass and starlight, and carried it to her. "Look." Iris turned toward her reflection and nearly gasped. Her face had changed. The gaunt hollowness had filled slightly, not with the false plumpness of health, but with something sharper. Her cheekbones had become geometric, architectural. Her eyes had brightened, and the iris now seemed to contain flecks of gold that hadn't existed before. Her lips, which had been nearly colorless, now held a deep rose hue, not the bloom of fever, but something richer. Something that suggested appetite. "What's happening to me?" Her voice was small, frightened. "You're becoming," Adrian said softly, "not dead, not quite alive. Something that exists in the sacred space between." He set the mirror down and returned to her bedside. "Your parents abandoned you thinking you were broken beyond repair, but some kinds of breaking are actually invitations. Your blood was calling for transformation, and I answered. You're a vampire." Not a question. "Yes. And you've made me—" "No," Adrian said firmly. "I've given you the choice to become what you're already becoming. But the choice itself, Iris, that remains entirely yours." She looked at her hands. The small tremors had stopped. Her fingers looked strong in a way they never had before, even in childhood. She could feel her heart beating, but the rhythm was different now, slower, more intentional, as though it were learning to count eternity instead of minutes. "If I refuse, then I'll help you die peacefully," Adrian said without hesitation. "But you should know, the transformation is already happening. Fighting it would only prolong your suffering." Iris looked back at the mirror, at the stranger wearing her face, at the thing she was becoming. "Tell me everything," she said. 3 days of education. Adrian moved through the manor like a ghost haunting his own life, opening rooms that held the sediment of centuries. A library where books were chained to shelves because knowledge, he explained, could be as dangerous as any weapon. A music room with a piano so old its ivory had yellowed to the color of bone. A gallery where paintings hung of women with Adrian's eyes, not daughters, he told her, but companions. Some had chosen to stay, others had chosen to leave, a few had chosen to die. "Why didn't you stop them?" Iris asked, running her fingers along the frame of a portrait dated 1743. "Because love that isn't chosen freely is just another form of captivity," Adrian replied. "I've lived long enough to know that immortality is a gift only to those who have decided that forever is worth the cost." On the 4th evening, as the sun bled into the horizon and painted the manor walls the color of old wounds, Adrian took her to a room she hadn't seen before. It was small, almost a library, but instead of books, the walls held mirrors. Every surface reflected back her new face, her transformed body, the thing she was still learning to inhabit. In the center of the room stood a single table. On it lay a book bound in leather so dark it seemed to absorb light. A pen, and a crystal glass filled with liquid that looked like captured moonlight. "This is the contract," Adrian said. "Every immortal signs one. It's not legal in any conventional sense. It's older than law, older than language." He opened the book, revealing pages of names written in different hands, different inks, spanning centuries. Each signature is a covenant, a promise that you understand what you're choosing. Iris looked at the empty page before her, at the pen, at the mirror reflecting her amber-eyed self. "And if I sign, then you belong to this house, to this life, to the gift of forever. You'll never hunger in the way humans do. You'll never age. You'll never sicken again. Adrian's voice was steady, but something underneath it trembled. And you'll carry the weight of watching everyone you once loved turn to dust while you remain. Why would anyone choose that? Because, Adrian said quietly, the alternative is to pretend that love has an expiration date, and some of us learned long ago that we're not capable of that lie. Iris picked up the pen. It was warm in her hand, as though it had been sitting in someone's grip just moments before. She could feel Adrian's presence behind her, not threatening, but present. A witness. She wrote her name in the book, Iris Margaret Ashmore. The handwriting looked like someone else's, stronger than hers had ever been, more certain. Then she lifted the glass of moonlight and drank. It tasted like snow and promises, like every moment of suffering she'd ever endured suddenly reframed as necessary, as preparation, as the architecture of her becoming. The transformation completed itself in that moment. She could feel it, the last vestiges of her human vulnerability burning away, replaced by something sharper, stronger, eternal. Adrian took the glass from her trembling hands. "Welcome home," he whispered. Iris turned to face him, and in that moment she understood something that would define the rest of her existence. Mercy and hunger were the same force, just wearing different masks. And now, I invite you to leave a trace of your presence in the comments. Tell us where in the world you're watching from, and the exact hour you hear this story. We wish to know how far these immortal confessions travel, and at what moments of the night they find you. The first hunt was ecstasy and horror braided into a single moment. Adrian had warned her that the thirst would be almost unbearable, that her new body would crave what her human self had never needed. But warning and experiencing were different countries, and no map prepared you for the border crossing. They moved through the London streets after midnight, when the city became a different entity. The darkness had texture now. Iris could smell the rain on the cobblestones, could hear the individual heartbeats of the sleeping residents behind closed doors, could taste the copper sweetness of blood in the air like a scent memory she'd never lived. Adrian moved beside her, a shadow in a top coat, his face illuminated occasionally by the gas lamps that flickered like dying insects. "You're searching for control," he said, "not food. The distinction matters." "How can you distinguish?" Iris asked. Every nerve in her body was screaming. The thirst was a predator living behind her ribs, clawing toward freedom. "Because," Adrian replied, "we are not animals. We are something far more dangerous, creatures that retain consciousness while experiencing hunger. That's the curse. That's also the grace." They stopped before a gentleman's club, the kind where power brokers and merchants met to discuss the world's division over port wine and cigars. Through a window, Iris could see a man alone in a back room, counting money, tallying the worth of human beings he'd sold into labor camps. Adrian had known exactly where to find him, exactly whose death would feed her without burdening her conscience. "Your choice," Adrian said simply. Iris had never been a violent person. The worst thing she'd ever done in her human life was refuse her mother's hand when they reached the gate. She had never hurt anyone, had never hunted anything. But the thing she was becoming understood predation with a clarity that felt like coming home to a place she'd never lived. She moved through the window, not breaking it, simply existing on the other side of it, as though glass were a suggestion rather than a barrier. The man looked up, startled, and for a moment his face held confusion, then recognition, not of her, but of what she was. Iris did not remember the details. The mind had a mercy of its own, blurring violence into shadow. She remembered the taste of him, copper and gold, power and corruption liquefying into sustenance. She remembered the sound of his heartbeat slowing, then stopping. She remembered the weight of a life passing from being to non-being through her own will. She remembered the exhilaration. When she pulled away, Adrian was waiting by the window. He was watching her with an expression that contained no judgment, only understanding. "How do you live with this?" Iris asked, her voice still echoing with harmonics that hadn't existed before. "By accepting that I am predator and that predators are part of the world's design," Adrian said. "By choosing whom I hunt with intention rather than appetite. By refusing to apologize for being alive, even though that life requires death." They walked through the rest of the night in silence. Iris could feel the man's blood working through her, strengthening her, making her more real than she'd ever been. Her sickness was gone entirely. In its place was something that tasted like power, but underneath that taste was another flavor: loneliness. "Does it ever get easier?" she asked as they approached the manor and the sky began its preliminary blushing toward dawn. Adrian looked at her, and for the first time she saw actual age in his expression. Not in his face, that remained beautiful, unchanging, but in his eyes. In the weight of centuries reflected there. "No," he said, "but it becomes bearable. And sometimes, if you're lucky, it becomes something else entirely." "What else?" "A reason to keep living." He opened the manor door, and the familiar velvet darkness welcomed them home. "For me, it was always going to be solitude, until you arrived at my gate." Iris understood then what he was offering. Not just immortality, not just power, but the possibility of bearing eternity with someone who understood its specific gravity. She took his hand as they climbed the stairs toward the morning they would sleep through. "Thank you," she said quietly, "for refusing to let me die." Weeks became months. Seasons turned their wheel, and Iris learned the language of immortality. It was not a language of celebration. It was a grammar of loss written in past tense, a vocabulary of adaptation, a syntax that had to bend around the unchanging fact of forever. She watched Adrian move through the manor like a man conducting an orchestra only he could hear. He showed her the library's vast collection. First editions of books that had shaped centuries, volumes on alchemy and philosophy, journals written by his own hand detailing the evolution of his understanding. In one journal, dated 1823, she found a pressed flower and 3 words: "She chose to leave." "Why did she go?" Iris asked, holding the journal like it contained sacred knowledge. "Because love is not eternal," Adrian replied quietly. "Only immortality is." She was wise enough to recognize the difference. The mirrors remained her greatest teacher and deepest torment. In them, she could see her own face losing humanity by increments. Her eyes had stopped changing color and settled into a shade of amber that matched Adrian's exactly. "A mark of his bloodline," he explained, "like a signature written in her iris." Her skin had developed a luminescence that no amount of powder could disguise. When she moved, shadows clung to her differently. Light refused to touch her with the same intimacy it granted to living things. She was becoming architecture, something beautiful and terrible and fundamentally other. One evening, in a moment of despair that came without warning, these moments still ambushed her. Grief arriving like an unwanted visitor, Iris threw a glass at the mirror in her room. It didn't shatter. The ancient glass had survived too many centuries to be broken by the tantrum of a 100-year-old vampire. Adrian found her sitting among the shards, her hands bleeding gold instead of red. "I'm losing myself," she told him. "I can barely remember what sunlight felt like on my skin. I'm forgetting the names of my mother's servants. I'm forgetting why I ever wanted to live." Adrian knelt before her and took her ruined hands in his. "That's not loss," he said. "That's translation. You're learning to think in a new language, and the old one is fading, not because you're losing yourself, but because you're becoming someone entirely new." "I don't want to be new," Iris whispered. "I want to go back." Then you know what you need to do, Adrian said without flinching. The contract works both ways. If you choose to end it, I will help you end it peacefully. I will never hold you captive to my version of forever. Iris looked at him, truly looked at him, saw the scar on his wrist from nearly 5 centuries ago, saw the way candlelight caught in his eyes like it was trying to remember what humanity looked like, saw the loneliness in him that her presence had only partially filled. "Have you ever regretted turning me?" she asked. "Every day," Adrian replied, "and never once." That paradox, she was beginning to understand, was the entire architecture of immortal love. She stood up, and without thinking, she moved to the vanity, picked up the ancient mirror, looked at the stranger wearing her face. The stranger looked back, and for the first time, Iris recognized herself in the reflection. Not her human self, not the girl her parents had abandoned, but something true beneath both of those. Something that had been searching for forever to become real. "I'm not ready to leave," she said quietly. Adrian stood behind her, and in the mirror, their reflections stood side by side. 2 creatures who had learned to love across the impossible distance between human and inhuman, mortal and eternal. "Good," he said, placing his hands on her shoulders. "Because I'm not ready to be alone again." The first sign that their isolation was ending came in the form of a letter, sealed in wax the color of fresh blood, addressed to Adrian in a hand that shook with age and fury. It arrived on a November evening, brought by a courier who seemed disturbed by the manor's lack of light, lack of servants, lack of normalcy. Adrian read it standing by the library window, his expression unreadable. "My mother is dying," Iris said, not a question. She had learned to read the architecture of his face. "Yes," Adrian confirmed. "She's requesting to see you. She's written to the only London magistrate who might know how to contact this estate." He turned to her. "She's offering forgiveness, offering to acknowledge you as her daughter before she dies." Iris felt something shatter inside her, not painful, but the way ice breaks in spring. A necessary fracturing that allows new growth. "Do you want to go?" Adrian asked. "Do you want me to?" "That's not the question that matters," Adrian replied. "What matters is what you need." Iris moved to the window and looked out at the November rain. Somewhere in London, in a townhouse in Belgravia, a woman who had once given her life and then taken it back was waiting for forgiveness she had no right to expect. "I'll go," Iris said, "but only if you come with me." Adrian turned to look at her, and she saw surprise flicker across his features. "You understand what that means? Exposure, risk, questions we can't answer?" "Yes," Iris said simply. "And I also understand that I'm done living as though I'm ashamed of what I am. If my mother is going to die, she's going to die knowing that her abandoned daughter became someone extraordinary, someone worthy, someone loved by someone who chose her when she was least lovable." That night, they entered London as they had left it, through darkness, moving like shadows made animate. The townhouse was familiar in a way that made Iris's new heart ache. The same mahogany staircase, the same oil paintings of ancestors who had died before she was born, the same smell of lavender and old money. Her mother lay in the master bedroom, reduced by illness to the thing Iris had once been, hollow, fading, afraid. The old woman's eyes opened when they entered, and for a moment, there was only confusion. Then, slowly, recognition. Not of her daughter as she had been, but as she had become. "My God," her mother whispered, "what have they done to you?" "They saved me," Iris said simply, "and I chose to let them." Adrian remained by the doorway, a shadow with amber eyes, watchful, protective, present. Iris's mother reached out a trembling hand, and after a hesitation that felt like the entire span of her previous life, Iris took it. The old woman's skin was paper thin, her pulse fluttering like a bird that had forgotten how to fly. "I was wrong," her mother said, "leaving you there. I was afraid and I was wrong." Iris held that hand as the old woman wept, as the woman who had birthed her and abandoned her processed the impossible truth, that her daughter had been saved by something she could not comprehend, and that salvation had made her beautiful in a way that transcended human aesthetics. At dawn, as her mother finally slept, Iris moved to the window where Adrian was waiting. "Is this the part where you tell me you're free now?" he asked quietly. "That you can leave the manor, return to the life you were supposed to have?" "No," Iris said. She took his hand, feeling the familiar cold of his skin. "This is the part where I tell you that I understand what you've given me. Not just immortality, but permission to become myself, even when myself is something my family never wanted me to be." Adrian's hand tightened on hers. "And what do you want now?" Iris looked back at her sleeping mother, at the life she had lived before abandonment, at the corpse of her former self, which Adrian had mercifully refused to let decay alone. "I want to go home," she said. "Back to the manor, back to you, back to the only place where my becoming makes sense." If this story has already captured you, leave a like. It helps the voices of those who chose eternity reach more hearts. Returning to the manor felt like coming home after a lifetime away, even though they had only been gone for a single night. The manor itself seemed to recognize them, seemed to exhale in relief as they crossed the threshold. The fires burned warmer. The darkness felt less like absence and more like embrace. But something had shifted during that night in her mother's townhouse. Iris could feel it in the way Adrian moved around her. Careful, as though she had become fragile, even though fragility was no longer written in her design. "What is it?" she asked as they sat by the library fire, the rain sketching patterns on the Gothic windows. "I made you something you weren't prepared to become," Adrian said quietly. "And now you're beginning to understand the cost." You held your mother's hand and felt her pulse slowing. You heard the specific rhythm of her heart as it began its final descent. And for the first time, you wanted to save her the way I saved you. "I can't," Iris said. It wasn't a question. No, the transformation would kill her at this stage of her life. Her body would reject it. The only mercy you can offer is presence. Adrian turned to look at her fully. "This is the weight immortals carry, Iris. We become capable of saving people, but we are limited in whom we can save. And we must watch everyone we love choose either death or the unknown terror of becoming what we are." Iris felt the realization settle into her like a second transformation. She had gained forever, but in gaining it, she had lost the ability to grant it to anyone except through her own bloodline. And even then, only if they were already dying, already at the threshold where the choice became binary rather than philosophical. "How do you bear it?" she asked. "By understanding that love was never meant to conquer death," Adrian replied. "It was meant to make life, however brief, however painful, mean something. Your mother is going to die. That's not failure. That's the architecture of being human. What matters is that when she dies, she'll know you're here. She'll know that being abandoned didn't destroy you. It transformed you." Over the following months, Iris's mother declined with the inevitability of autumn leaves turning brown. Iris would visit the townhouse regularly, always at night, always with Adrian waiting in the shadows beyond the town car. She would hold her mother's hand and tell stories of the manor, carefully edited to exclude the supernatural but full of details about the library, the music room, the endless corridors where she had learned to think in centuries instead of years. Her mother's last words were, "I'm so proud of what you became. I'm sorry it took me this long to say it." Iris wept in ways immortals aren't supposed to. Adrian held her for 3 days while the grief worked through her system like a virus of emotion, burning away the last pretense that she could ever return to her human life. At the funeral, Iris did not attend. It would have been too strange, too impossible to explain. But she stood in the churchyard afterward, hidden by fog and Adrian's careful positioning, and watched the coffin being lowered into the earth. A woman nearby, a young woman in black, a cousin Iris barely remembered, suddenly looked up, staring directly at the space where Iris stood. For a moment, their eyes met. The cousin's expression shifted from grief to terror, as though she had seen something that defied explanation. Then, Adrian pulled Iris back into shadow, and the moment ended. "She saw something," Iris whispered. "Yes," Adrian confirmed. "She saw the truth, that something far stranger than death walks this world. But by morning, she'll convince herself it was a trick of grief, and by next year, she'll have forgotten entirely." Iris understood then that she had joined a club of one, essentially. Adrian had others like him scattered across Europe and beyond. But she was truly alone in her specific grief, the daughter who had become something her family could never comprehend, watching them die because comprehension required transformation, and transformation was only possible for those already at death's door. "Why?" she asked Adrian as they returned to the manor. "Why would any immortal choose this, if every human they love becomes a ghost, haunting their memory?" Adrian took her hand as they walked through the manor gardens, where flowers bloomed in the darkness as they had for centuries, a supernatural abundance that defied botanical law. "Because," he said, "the alternative is to stop loving entirely, and I learned long ago that a life without love is not worth the eternity it's wrapped in." Iris squeezed his hand, understanding that this was his answer, and his curse spoken in the same breath. 5 years after Iris arrived at the gate, she stood at the same wrought iron barrier and understood what Adrian had meant when he spoke of the manor as a form of immortality itself. The gate had not changed. The stone pillars still bore witness to abandonment and rescue. The rain still fell on the grounds with the regularity of prayer. But Iris was no longer the desperate girl who had collapsed here, begging for an end. She was the beginning of something else entirely. Adrian approached from behind. She could have heard his footsteps from anywhere, but she chose to listen for him with her heart instead of her ears. He placed his hands on her shoulders, and they stood together, watching the boundary between their world and the world beyond. "Do you regret it?" he asked. After 5 years, he still asked this question at least once a year, as though her answer might change, as though she might suddenly decide that forever was a prison rather than a gift. "Every day," Iris replied, "and never once." "She's parroting you now," Adrian said with something that might have been a smile in his voice. "We're parroting each other," Iris corrected. "That's what it means to build a life together. To speak the same language long enough that your words become indistinguishable." Iris turned to face him. In 5 years, she had learned to read his face like a history book. She could see the centuries written in the architecture of his features. She could see the loneliness that had finally found a companion to share the weight of forever. "I've been thinking about something," she said. "Tell me." "I want to turn someone." Adrian's expression went very still. "Who?" "I don't know yet," Iris admitted, "but there will be someone. Some girl abandoned the way I was. Some boy left at the edge of mercy the way I was left at your gate. Someone who is dying and deserves a choice I never got to make. Someone we can save together." Adrian was silent for a long moment. Then, slowly, he reached up and touched her face with fingers that had touched centuries' worth of lives and said, "Yes." "Yes?" Iris had expected resistance, had expected him to explain why bringing another immortal into the manor would complicate their isolation, their carefully constructed peace. "Yes," he repeated, "because I realized 5 years ago when you appeared at my gate that the curse of immortality is not living forever. It's living forever alone. And if you're willing to share this burden with someone else, then perhaps we're not damned after all. Perhaps we're simply waiting." "For what?" Iris asked. "Iris, for the day when immortals stop thinking of themselves as predators and start thinking of themselves as a family. Adrian took her hand and pulled her away from the gate, back toward the manor that had become their entire universe. "Come inside. I want to show you something." They moved through rooms Iris thought she knew by heart, but Adrian led her to a door she had never noticed before, which was impossible and yet somehow perfect given the nature of the manor. Behind the door lay another library, smaller than the first, but its walls contained something far more precious than books. They held photographs, decades and decades of photographs spanning centuries. Adrian and a woman with raven hair laughing in a garden. 1934, Adrian and a man with scarred hands standing before a cathedral. 1847. Adrian alone, his face closed against the world. 1752. And then, newest of all, a photograph from just 2 weeks ago, Adrian and Iris, standing before the manor at twilight, his hand on her waist, her hand touching his face, both of them looking at the camera with an expression that transcended mortality. "These are your loves," Iris said quietly. "These are my reasons," Adrian replied, "for not giving in, for continuing to exist, for believing that forever could mean something other than endless repetition of the same grief." Iris looked at his face in profile as he studied the photographs, saw, perhaps for the first time, not the ancient predator or the tragic immortal, but the man underneath, the one who had survived centuries by choosing to love despite knowing that love would inevitably end in loss. "Will I end up here?" she asked. "In this wall of photographs as one of your reasons even after I'm gone?" Adrian turned to her, and for a moment something very human and very broken showed itself in his expression. "We don't know," he said simply. "That's the real terror of immortality, Iris. It's that even we don't know forever. We can't predict what we'll feel next century, what we'll choose next 1,000 years. We can only say yes or no to today." Iris moved to the photograph of them and touched the glass. In it, she could see the beginning of something that might, if they were very lucky and very careful, become a story worth living forever to complete. "Then my answer is yes," she said. "Yes to today. Yes to tomorrow. Yes to the next girl who arrives at your gate dying and afraid. Yes to building something that's not just survival, but legacy. Yes to becoming a family instead of just two creatures haunting the same house." Adrian pulled her close, and for the first time in their 5 years together, he kissed her, not as a predator claims prey, not as an ancient vampire teaches a new immortal, but as one person kisses another person they have chosen, repeatedly and eternally, to love. The kiss tasted like blood and mercy, like death and resurrection, like the beginning of a story that had no ending written in its architecture. When they parted, the manor seemed to exhale around them. The fires burned warmer. The darkness became less like absence and more like acceptance. The gates, forever open now to possibility, stood ready to receive the next desperate soul who would arrive seeking death and find instead Adrian and Iris waiting with resurrection written in their amber eyes. Outside, the rain continued its ancient percussion against the stone. Inside, two immortals stood before their wall of photographs and began to imagine the faces of everyone they would save, everyone they would love, everyone who would join them in the mansion between life and death where mercy learned to wear eternity's face. The gate remained open. It would remain open forever, and that, finally, was enough. Subscribe if you believe mercy can resurrect even the damned. Comment eternal if you'd trade your soul for love that heals. Like if you believe even monsters deserve a second chance.